So he's camped out in there. I don't think there's anything else that we're going to go over business-wise, because we're going to get right into this. We have Kerry here from CU Woodshops up in Champaign to show us the shape of origin. And
okay, thank you, Dustin. I know at least one of you, if you aren't familiar with CU Woodshop Supplies, we've been around since about 2009. We recently restructured, new owner, new location, still carrying a variety of woodworking tools. If you're in the area, come by, check out our lumber selection. There's really nobody else quite like us in Midwest area. That's the brief business side. I'm here to talk about the Shaper Origin. This is one of my favorite tools. I've had this for the last 2.5 or 3 years. I've made all kinds of things from custom inlays to plaques and signs to just recently I've been experimenting with dovetail joints. This is about the most expensive dovetail jointer that you can buy on the market right now. So I'm going to take you through how it works from the top to bottom, from laying out the first piece of the tape to setting up the design to how it cuts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons versus the traditional handheld router, and more importantly, the pros and cons versus the traditional benchtop CNC machines. If you haven't heard, this is the world's first handheld CNC router. So what I mean by CNC is computer numerically controlled. Don't bother remembering that, there's not going to be a pop quiz. All that it really means in layman's terms is that it's reading this domino alignment, and you can lay it out with tape on whatever project you're working on, like so. And it uses the position of these dominoes to triangulate the position of the router bit. It knows at all times, to a high degree of accuracy, where the center of that router bit is at, and that's how it gets you to the 1,000th of an inch accuracy on your cuts. For most woodworking applications, you do not need to be that accurate. If anybody wants to try, this was cut to 5/1000ths of an inch offset, and I don't think there's room for glue in here, and I think even Dustin here would struggle getting this joint apart. It is just too tight. Again, most woodworking projects, you do not need to be that accurate, but there are plenty of applications where you do want that level of accuracy, especially if you're cutting metalworking, or if you're doing custom inlay. You want to know that your pieces are going to fit the very first time that you're putting them together. It is already getting hot, excuse me. So like I said, the Shaper Origin reads off of the domino tape. It comes in, rolls like this. It's about $0.01 an inch. You can lay it out just about on any surface as long as it's not too porous or dirty. It's mildly adhesive. They don't do a stronger adhesive because they don't want you leaving residue on whatever work project you've got. I have taken it off and reused it between projects. If I'm just working on plywood, it's very easy to peel off and then lay down more. The trick to using it is to make sure that you've got the full dominoes completely smooth. Any little bits hanging off the side, the shaper won't read in because it cannot tell that that's a full domino. If you can see on this screen, let me try to position that a little bit better. More of the glare. Alright. You can see the black dominoes under there. They're already highlighted as blue by the camera on the Origin. That means that it's gotten a read on them. What I'm doing right now is the first step of any project with the Shaper Origin is scanning in the Workspace. So what that is there's a camera in the back of this. You can see it's picking up my hand now. That's taking one photo every 1/10 of a second, something like that. Just like taking a panoramic photo on your phone. It's going to take all of those images and then put them together into one representation of your Workspace. So you can see I'm picking up the things around it. If I go too far off to the side, it starts to turn red. It no longer sees the domino tape. It doesn't know where it's at. But once I move back over the workpiece, it repositions and realizes what it's doing. creating this workspace, it's just putting all those hundreds of images that it's taken together, and this is what I'm going to do my designs on. So what you can see on the screen is not picking up by the camera, it is the digital representation of the workspace. You're not actually looking at anything from the camera, and you can see, moving my hand in front of it, nothing's happening. The only thing that it's doing, if you watch the top right hand corner, there's a little domino right there. That's your representation of how well it can see the tape and how well it knows its position. If I cover that camera, it turns red, and I'm moving it, it doesn't know what it's doing. If I move my hand, it repositions automatically. It is a very smart little tool, much smarter than myself. It's always going to be accurate if it's got the domino tape in alignment. With a set workpiece like this workstation, it's always going to be able to reposition itself just fine. You don't have to worry about tape coming loose or getting cut up during your project or anything like that. I will talk more about the different types of projects and how to lay out tape just briefly. I do have a lot to cover tonight, and I want to leave time at the end for everybody to try it that wants to. So once it's scanned in, it does save your workspace on the origin itself. As I scroll down here, you can see these are the hundreds of different times that I've scanned this in. Every workpiece that it's seen before, it remembers from the orientation of the dominoes. You can see I've scanned in this particular workstation a lot of times. Anything with that little eye on there is something that it doesn't recognize. It's not sure what that piece is because it doesn't see it. If I take something that I've scanned before and put it in front of the camera, actually, let me do it over here. It will again remember that workspace, and I can reload whatever I was working on immediately. So it knows, because it can see the domino tape on this piece of plywood, what I was doing with this piece before, which was just a little bit of inlay I was playing around with over the weekend. It's convenient for when you've started a project and you get a phone call and you have to walk away, it remembers where you're at, or maybe you put down the project and you don't come back to it for half a year. If it sees the domino tape in the same alignment, you can pick up exactly where you left off. I tend to do that pretty often, where I will start cutting on like a slab at work and then I don't have a chance to get back to it for the next week or so. It's convenient. It's not exactly necessary. Most people will try to get through a workpiece all in one go, but it's certainly a quality of life thing that Shaper and Tool Technic are thinking about. Any questions about scanning in? All right. Oh, I'm sorry.
Does it have like a hard drive in there where you can take a chip out and put a chip in there?
It's not removable. It does have a hard drive, just like any computer. That's where it's storing everything. The memory on this thing, I don't remember what the total size is, probably a couple gigabyte.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, since they've gotten these workspace sizes down to a pretty small size, I've got, like you saw, about 200 of those saved on here, and there's no problem with running speed or anything like that. The only time I ever ran into a problem with load time on this was when I was working on a living room floor, which was about 20 feet by 10 feet, and I had domino tape laid out, and it was just, I think, getting close to the size that the onboard RAM, that's just the amount of memory that the computer has access to, was a little bit taxed. But for most things that I've worked on, 4x8 sheets of plywood, 5x10s, it runs just fine with no lag. Yep, thank you. All right, so with designs, there's a couple different ways that you can get them on here. You can create your own. It's got a few built-in functions. It's got circles, rectangles, a pin trace, some basic text, and box joints. I am going to cover setting up and cutting box joints, but briefly, you can very easily set circles. I have actually done circles quite often. I don't have a circle cutting jig, so I tend to just whip this out every time I need to cut a perfect circle, which for whatever reason I have to do surprisingly often. The nice thing is, once I've laid this out on whatever material I'm cutting, I know that I'm going to get a perfect circle every time. So I have set it to 6 inches, and you can see on there the black lines on the outside. That is a 6-inch diameter circle, and I can move and position this wherever I want to within my workspace, as long as I can see tape. The only thing I can't do is if I get too close to one edge. You can see that there's the red trapezoid on top. That's the field of view of the camera. If it can't see enough tape, you can't position something there, and you wouldn't want to cut there anyways. So when I'm placing things to cut, I always try to plan ahead and make sure that as I'm cutting, for example, around this circle, that I've got that nice black domino in that top left right-hand corner to make sure that I'm not going to lose sight of the tape and lose position on the router. It is only as accurate as your hands and the domino tape. So the basic text is a straight line text. You can import through things like Inkscape and Fusion 360, SketchUp, VCarve. There's a lot of computer-aided design software out there that's CAD, and computer-aided machining software that's CAM that can import SVG files to this tool. I'm not going to spend much time talking about that. If you already know, you know. If you don't, I'd be happy to explain a little bit towards the end if people have questions. It's a very deep subject that would be difficult to cover in the time that I've got here. Suffice it to say, it works off of the very basic scalable vector graphic file, which is just a file that has points and lines between the points. And if you've got something like that, it very easily imports either through USB, or you can have things downloaded directly to the tool through what they call the Shaper Hub. Here's a list of mortise and tenon joints that I've downloaded offline and over the Wi-Fi that Dustin has provided to me. My Shaper knows that I've got access to these files. I can grab this butterfly, and it's already available on my tool, downloaded over the Wi-Fi that it's connected to. Once you've got vectors on the tool, you can do some basic things for adjusting them. If I'm placing this butterfly and I know that, well, the 2.5 by 4.5 just isn't quite big enough, I can adjust that to basically whatever size I want. If I wanted a 20-inch tall butterfly, I can do that. As long as I've got the tape laid out and a piece of wood big enough, this can go as big or as small as you really need to. There's a whole long list of files that you can download off of their website that users of the tool have made available for public use. If you've got kids that are into dinosaurs, here's a whole suite of dinosaurs that you can cut out and inlay. If you want to make your own, that's very easy. All you need is that CAD software. There's plenty of free options out there that I mentioned, like Inkscape, Fusion 360, and SketchUp are some of the more popular ones. Personally, I like Inkscape and Fusion 360. If you want to know why, ask me again later and I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. But what I want to show you here is how to actually set up the grid and cut box joints. So, real quick before I get into that, just like any router, you've got a collet that holds the bits, and then just power switch for the router motor itself. The Shaper Origin only takes 1/4 inch right now. I suspect in the future they're going to come out with a more powerful tool and probably up it to like 2200 watts and 1/2 inch shank. Knowing what I do about Festool and their parent company Tool Technic that owns Shaper, it seems very likely that in the next 2 to 3 years they'll have a more powerful router motor available, because all of the design software that you have already built for this will work just fine with a more powerful router. So right now I've just got a straight bit in here, I'm going to use that to set the grid. I need a straight edge on the router bit for the next part. Dustin, can we rotate this table real quick? Just if you swing your side out. It's perfect. Okay. So I've got a board in this workstation already. I like the workstation. It gives me a nice 90 degree. I'm going to leave it at that for right now, just because there's a lot that I want to cover. But setting up the grid is creating a Cartesian plane. That's just the XY with a 0, 0 origin point. I want to use that to position my SVG files so that it knows and I know to a high degree of accuracy where it's going to cut. And the way that you do that is with the built-in software on the tool. If you can't quite read that, it's instructions on how to lower the bit to make sure that it makes contact with the edge of the material I've got in here. So I've got that straight edge just registered against the already milled piece of stock. I've got the depth set, and you can see on that image where that line is at. That's because it knows that I've got a 1/4 inch bit in there and that I want to register against the side. I am just going to rotate the router so that that line is as flat as possible with the image. And I get 2 reference points. So those 2 reference points gets me a line. The 3rd reference point on the other side of the material, on the perpendicular edge, gets me my 3rd. And you can see where they came together is now my origin point. On top, you can see that I've now got a grid point of 0, 0, and the XY. If I move up here, that is the 1/2 inch X and 1/2 inch Y. So anything that I place, like if I wanted to place a dinosaur at 5'5", I can easily do that. That would be right here on that Cartesian plane. So I know that if I've got a reference edge on any piece of material that's got a 90 degree angle on there, you're going to be able to place it exactly where you want within that grid. For the box joints, it will actually create the cut file for you. I've already got most of this set up for what I was doing before. This is the bit size, so I'm going to use a 1/4 inch bit. The material thickness itself is 1/2 inch, give or take a 1/16 of an inch whenever I milled it. The width is 6 inches, and I'm going to leave it at 14 pins. I am actually going to up this glue gap size because the last time I did this, that glue gap just wasn't quite enough. I had to do a second pass to make it even bigger to get this little Osage box joint to even fit together and leave room for a glue gap. So let's make that. What did you use, Bob, on yours? Do you remember?
What number you have up there?
It's 0.00, it's 0.08 of an inch.
I usually use that or even .09.
0.09, 900ths?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's try that. That sounds much better. So, if you didn't see it, I'll do it one more time. When that gets set up, it creates the vectors over here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You can see that it knows that this is going to be the A side of my box joint. And it's got the gray and light gray. That is going to be the cut lines that I'm going to use in there. So, since this creates it for you, I am just going to set the pin or the anchor that they gave me at my 0, 0 point. And then if I zoom in, you should see the top of this is, there we go. This little piece of material back here is my spoiler board. And then the edge of my cut piece is about right there. You can see that it lines up nicely with that 1/2 inch Y line that I've got there. So I'm going to be removing the material in between these pins all the way down along this. When I get to the next step, it's very convenient for me. If I want to swap to the B side, I can put in the next piece and then just tap this swap button on here, and it changes those vectors over to the B side, and it knows where to cut to get the box joint to fit together nicely. Again, that's just tapping the swap down here to get those two different sets of vectors.
So you're gonna have two boards that are A side, and then the other two are perpendicular, that would be the B side.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, this was what I started with. If I remember correctly, this was the B side I did on the first one, but I'm just going to use the other end of this as the B. All right. So when it comes time to cut, just like any router, you want to make sure that you've got the right bit in there. As I switch that out, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the settings here. The one on the top left corner, that's the depth of cut. Right now it's set to -0.05 of an inch, so that would be above my material. I'm going to leave that as is for right now. So I'm going to talk through the first inch cut. There it is. Save you the hassle of making this mistake. There is a single Allen screw on the side of this that clamps the router down. You have to make sure that's tight, otherwise, as you try to plunge, it's going to push the router itself up and most likely ruin your cuts. Alright, so the top left was the depth of cut. When I actually cut it, I'm going to just set it to 1/2 inch. This is very important. This is the style of cut. Right now it's set to inside. The first one I'm actually going to do is a pocket because I want to remove all of this material in between the A pins on this box joint. That dark gray and with a white hash mark area is where you will actually remove with the bit. So I'm going to do one pass for the pockets, and then I'm going to do one pass with the inside cut. The reason for that is this knows that when you're cutting your pockets, you don't want to go right up to the edge. The reason it does that, it gives you a little bit of an offset because it wants you to do that inside pass as your final cut to get a smooth quality of cut. If you were to do the whole thing, just starting with the inside, that's when you're going to get more tear out, and we all know we don't like tear out. You've got an offset here. Like I said, it's by default, the offset on the pockets is about 1/10 of an inch, so you don't really need to adjust this for the pocket. If you wanted to make it larger or smaller for some reason, you can. I tend to use this more when I'm doing like inlay and I want to make sure that the inlay piece fits into whatever mortise that I've made. I will offset this by usually about 1/100 of an inch just to make sure it will fit in nice and snug. This is the bit diameter. It's got some quick settings for 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, and engraving bits. You can program in whatever bit that you want. And it's got a Z-touch function, which I'll do real quick. You won't be able to see it on the camera, but if you can see down here underneath the tool, there's a little plate. That has to be touching a work surface when you do the Z-touch, because when the bit touches the top of your material, it relieves some of the pressure off of this plate, and that's how it knows that it's been zeroed out. And the reason that I'm doing the Z-touch is because when I say I want to cut a 1/2 inch deep, it needs to know where 0 is to know to go down a 1/2 inch from there.
You're gonna have to tip until you get the screen the right way. Just tip the whole machine.
Whole machine.
Just tip. Yep. One way or another.
Moving the other way. There we go. Hey, thank you. Alright. So if you didn't see it, I'm going to do it one more time and turn it towards you. I've got the bit positioned over the material that I'm going to cut, and I'm just tapping that Z-touch. Yep. And
Don't let me interrupt.
yeah. And it's going down, it taps the wood just barely, and then it releases, and then the machine knows where Z of 0 is. So, just like in math class, you're setting up your coordinate system. I've got a 0, 0, 0 for X, Y, and Z all set up, so I know that it's going to cut where I want it to. Alright, I'm going to briefly talk with the motor off about what to expect when you're actually cutting, because this is one of the more interesting things that the shaper does. It kind of turns cutting pieces out into a bit of a game. So this is what you see when you're cutting. Again, I've got this set to -0.05 of an inch offset, so it's going to be above my material. But when you're cutting, oops, can't touch the screen while I do it. That white dot represents the center of the bit, and that circle is about a 1/2 inch diameter. That's the movement that the motor can make on the XY plane. So if you can see that as I'm trying to push it this way, if anybody wants to come closer and see it, you can do so now, or again, there's going to be a time at the end for everybody to try it if they want. You can see it up close then. I am pushing that white dot towards the side of that circle. It's not moving the blue cut area any further out because it knows that that's going to be out of bounds for the cut that I want to make. If I go too far, it's going to abort the cut, pull the bit up and out, and then if you want to start cutting again, you have to move it back into position and then re-plunge. If you shake the router, it cannot adjust as quickly as you can move it. So you can't be doing this kind of thing while making your cuts. Just like any router, it's going to leave you with a jagged edge, and you don't want that. You do have to have some control to be able to move and glide smoothly through the cuts. Basically just like that. You will have some resistance, just like with any router when you're cutting. The wood grain can carry the bit a little bit. With how small 1/4 inch bits are, you don't tend to get a lot of that. And especially if you're cutting an end grain like I am here, it's all straight anyways, so there's not much grain to pull on the router, especially one with as heavy a base as I've got here. But just like with any router, there are certain safety things that you have to consider when you're making cuts. So just be aware that if you're cutting curly material or anything with unusual grain, the bit may try to run away on you. So make sure that when you're actually cutting, you're holding both handles, and you'll be all set. When you go to do your inside cut, it changes what you're seeing as your cut. It gives you a dashed line, and if you can see, there's a little arrow up top. That's the direction it wants me to go. If I try to go the other direction against the grain, it will abort the cut if I go too far. But as you're moving along with the cut, it's going to adjust itself to stay on that line. So this will be my second pass. We'll be doing that inside cut to get right up to the edge and hopefully a nice clean cut at the end. Before I actually start cutting on this, there's a few other little things I want to show, and that's just, if you're doing something fine with a lot of detail on it, for example, this tree of life, once it downloads, maybe a little big. You can see there's a lot of lines all over the place on here. If I were to be cutting this with an engraving bit,
So you got a programmed bit in there too, the kind of bit you put in there,
mm-hmm.
and then it calculates
Yeah.
the speed.
You control the speed manually on the front of the router, but what it's doing for you is it's actually calculating the diameter of the bit as you're cutting. So it's got quick settings for 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch. I haven't gone to anything larger than 1/2 inch. It's hard for me to find a 1/4 inch shank with anything larger than a 1/2 inch bit. I may have actually loaded too much onto this one file. We'll give it just a minute to catch up with me. What I want to show is when cutting fine details like this, it will actually control itself for you. as it goes through the style cut. If you guys want to pass that around, you can see all of that was cut with the stock engraving bit and then just filled with epoxy. We're going to do the quick reset. There is no off switch. You just have to unplug it when it does something like that. Sorry about that, Jim. Yeah. I'll grab a smaller vial. While this is briefly rebooted and I'm getting it back to where it was, they push out updates for this tool about every 3 to 6 months. The most recent one was what they called the Inverness update. If I remember correctly, they fixed some of the problems that they had with doing pocket joints, just to make it a little bit smoother as you're cutting along those pockets. The one before that, they added the box joint feature. This is just speculation, but I think one day soon they'll add a dedicated dovetail feature to this tool. Yeah, you can see it actually remembers exactly where I was. So if I were to be cutting on something like this, you can see that dashed line is where is the problem that I'm going too far. Let's just get rid of you. There we go. This is the same tree that I gave you guys to pass around. Alright, so you can see that dot wants to run along the lines of that vector. I'm not actually touching it. It will move itself inside the cuts if you just hold the green button. As far as it can go within there. If you go out, it will abort. But the nice thing is that if you're doing tricky curves and things like this, you don't actually have to move the base of the router to match the curves perfectly. Just get it wherever you're trying to go within that 1/2 inch diameter circle, and then hold the green button as it moves along the path of cut.
So once you get your 1/2 inch, you just move it over a little more and do the same thing again.
Yep, exactly. This will also do math for you, and it can convert between Metric and Imperial. So if you, actually let's do something different. If you wanted to do something that was 11/33, you can just type that in and it'll give you, oh, yep, perfect, just 1/3. So if you're cutting something like this, one of the more recent changes as well was that they have a Helix. You can see that right down here it's highlighted. All that is that when you're doing plunge cuts, what it used to do was just plunge straight down to the bottom. This will actually Helix as it goes down. It's convenient whenever you're doing a deep but narrow cut like this. I tend to use it if I'm using dowels for joinery on projects, or putting in like what were the name of the hinges that you used, Bob, on your box?
The box?
Yeah, the box hinges.
Yeah.
If you're drilling out box hinges now, the Helix function is really nice. Just you get a smoother quality of cut when it spirals to the final depth instead of just plunging a 1/4 inch bit straight to the bottom. That tends to burn out. So again, it's just a nice little quality of life option that they have recently added. Okay. Set that back to 1/2 inch. And just to be sure, I'm going to Z-touch this. There we go. Any questions about setting up cuts? Okay, I'm going to turn on the vac in the router and actually cut through the A side of this, and then Do you have the time, Dustin?
641.
6:41. Okay. Yep. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the A side of this box. Nice and done. Before I set up to do the B side, which I'll invite anyone that wants to try and cut it to come up and cut that part if they're interested, I want to talk a little bit about where this machine lies in the market. Just about anything that you can do with a standard router, this has made a little bit cleaner and easier. The primary benefit is that you no longer need jigs or templates to do your cuts. That is what I see as the key feature to the Shaper Origin over just buying a standard like 110 watt router and then just buying a series of butterflies or circle jigs, or if you even wanted to do like a true butterfly inlay, you can buy all of those separately, but this brings them all together in one roof. You don't need to spend time cutting out. If you, for example, if you actually wanted to do this butterfly inlay, you don't have to have a different jig for each piece of this butterfly. Everything is on board on the Shaper, and if you know how to set up your projects and what kind of bits to use, you can cut out perfect marquetry to inlay butterflies like this. It's also repeatable. If you're doing a lot of one thing, you can do it with any sort of CNC. The downside to this over a benchtop model is that you actually be here holding it to run it. You can't just turn on a 4x4 or 4x8 CNC and walk away or leave the room as it's cutting out for like 100 circles. That's a good example. We had once cut for work 100 little coasters for somebody's wedding that had the bride and groom's names engraved on them. I could stand there and cut each one individually with this. I would have to go through and do every one of the names with an engraving bit first, and for 100 circles like that, that's probably 45 minutes to an hour-long job in itself. And then you'd have to go through and do, most likely in more than one pass, each one of the circles to cut it out. With the benchtop CNC, we laid everything out, clamped down the material, turned the thing on, came back about 2 hours later, and it was all done and ready to go. Where this really shines, though, is that you're not limited on your cut size. So if you can lay tape out along it, and you've got a known flat surface, this can cut on it. Where people tend to be using this right now is like taking it into people's homes to use it. I've done a couple of like bar top engravings for one of my friends owns a little bar in Urbana, and I engraved the names of the owners on the end of it. They weren't going to remove the bar from their business to bring into the shop to lay out on a CNC. This, I could just walk in there, I laid out the tape, I started cutting, and we had it refinished in the same afternoon. It was very quick and convenient. Same thing with like, I know somebody that's doing a lot of living room floors. You can take this right in there. If you're doing a lot of like marquetry, I find this a little bit more convenient than the large CNCs, because I have a hard time clamping down like thin material onto a CNC bed. But with something simple like this, you can use the same board to lay out, and then just clamp a piece of veneer on the bottom side, and then just cut straight through with your engraving bit and get accurate cuts out for inlay and marquetry repeatedly wherever you've got a convenient surface to cut through to. I need some water. Anybody got questions about?
Let me get your bottle of water.
Oh, no, I got some. Thank you, though.
Those box joints that you just cut, I assume the corners are still rounded and you chisel them out?
Nope.
Kinda look like it from the.
If you want to come over, you can see it, or I'll pass this around. I believe
Cut
that.
on the end or on the flat? You know,
You've seen the waste board, Mike.
Yeah, you're. So I'm cutting straight through with the spoiler board behind it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So doing dovetails with this can be a bit trickier. With the box joints, all you really have to do is flip the boards over. But of course, with dovetails, you have to be very particular about what your inside corner is versus your outside. But yeah, as long as you can cut through, you're not going to end up with rounded corners or need a chisel for the box joints. Okay.
What is the small size bit you can use on there? Is it just 1/8? You can't go below that then?
For straight bits,
Yeah.
or for straight bits, I mean it's whatever you can find, as long as it's got a 1/4 inch shank.
Okay.
Because right now they don't have any other collets for the shaper. The finest point bit that I know of is a pencil point bit, which is, I want to say, 3/64 of an inch at the tip.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. So if you can get handwriting actually pretty well with that. One of the things I started doing recently was there's a family cookie recipe, which I will not share, that my grandma has been perfecting over about 70 years. And the little card that she's got it on has, of course, faded a bit over time, but I am engraving her handwriting and the recipe onto cutting boards as Christmas gifts for my aunts and uncles, so the recipe will be available to everyone in the family. So with a fine enough bit, you can mimic handwriting quite well, even with this tool. Okay. I'm going to get this pulled out. Make sure I've got it marked. that's going to be the one that I use for the B side. So, if we could turn this actually back to us, I'm going to talk a little bit about the workstation as I set this up. Thanks. So I do have a spoiler board on here. For box joints, it is nice for the relief cut. You just get a smoother quality like you will on any spoiler board. I find it particularly useful when cutting dovetails. I don't think I'm even going to attempt them anymore without a spoiler board back there. If you look closely at the dovetails info I've got there, you can see some blowout on a couple of the tails from where I didn't have the spoiler board behind it. I do find this workstation mighty convenient. I will tell you though, you can make your own very easily. Before this became widely available by Shaper, there is about a half dozen people that made their own plans to build one. And I built mine out of about a half sheet of plywood, some T-track, and just a couple of clamps for around $50 versus the, I want to say $350 or so for the workstation now. The nice thing about this though, I don't have to worry about making sure that this is the right angle. When this is locked in nice and tight, I know that this is going to be 90 degrees every time. The one that I've made, I've got to take a square too every time I set it up. So they did really think this through. When I am setting material up in here, I can use this as the flat surface to register the top of my material movements. And I've got, if you can see it, there's a little bar over here. There's 2 reference pins on here, and you can actually have an angle setter over here. I know that this was my X of 0 when I set up the grid the first time. So when I put in this other board, knowing that when I had previously planed and ripped and then cross-cut this board before, the width is going to remain the same on this piece. So I don't have to worry about changing that grid or moving any of the alignment for my cuts. There we go. As long as I've got it flat over here and then flat up here, it's going to use the same exact vectors that I'd set up before. Alright, I've got that in. It feels like it's perfectly flush with the top of that spoiler board. I can still move the router over the top of it. I am going to erase my previous cut lines. If you can see this little eraser looking thing right here, that will erase previous cuts. And then I'm just going to swap to the other set of vectors. So I could, if I really, really wanted to be sure, I could go through and reset up the grid by using the alignment bit and then reposition this vector back to 0, 0. I have found that as long as I'm using this bar for the top and this for the side, I don't really need to do that. So this is already ready to cut for the B side. Would anyone like to come and play with the shaper? Alright, I will go ahead and cut the B side then. see, I've got a little bit left over there. What I think I did wrong was set the bit depth. Did I get that right? What did I do here? Well, any mistake is an opportunity to learn, of course.
You just have to use that thick glue.
Yeah, that's exactly what I need.
It's like all fine.
Got that set right.
You're the only one in here that does something like that.
Yeah. Oh, don't I know it? Oh, you know what?
Just make a smaller box.
Yeah, I think I know what I did. I think when I cut my A side, I had left an offset on the inside pass. So it was cutting a little bit larger than what it should have been. Well,
These machines always do what you tell them to do.
yeah, no, I'm going to own that mistake. This did exactly what I told it to. And you can see that the edges are lining up where I want it to. So, yeah, you live and learn. And I've still got a lot of learning to do, it seems.
Just cut some thinner wood and make it fancy.
Yeah. Yeah, there are ways to save it, but, what was that?
You mind passing it around so we can see the fit?
Yeah, so that was the one that I did before I came, and then if you flip it over, you can see the one that I just did. Yep. Okay.
Those wood shims.
You said something earlier about changing the dimension or something like 900s.
Mm-hmm.
Did you mean 900s or 9,000s?
So what I had done when I was creating the box joints was I had
900s is quite a bit.
so that could be where that came from, because
Originally,
yeah. So that actually might be it rather than, because I don't remember if I had the offset set the previous time. So I may have misunderstood the glue gap because I was doing a very fine one before. If it compounds, if that glue gap is for both sides of that box joint, you can kind of. It is.
It's gonna have to be, because
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to cut it in half and take off half of that off of either side. It's going to take that off on both sides. So my gap is really more like 0.18.
Right.
And that's probably close, because it looks like that gap is over that 1/8 of an inch.
Yeah, I usually go 0.009, somewhere.
009, yeah.
Yeah, 9,000s and 900s.
Yep.
And that was 008 when you started.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 0.09 was what I'd done on the other side of that, and then I actually had to go through a second time and do a 1/100th of an inch offset on the B side in order to get that joint to fit. Because the first time I cut that one, it came out. This one was the default of 0.008 of an inch on the glue joint. Yeah, whoever gets it apart can eat any of the leftovers.
Wow.
Yeah, I had to take clamps to it to pull it apart, and I had to mallet it together. Hey, so we all learned together. That's the important thing. Doing things like dovetails, the setup is very similar. You're going to create your grid and do the alignment. The trick, though, is that after you cut with your dovetail bit, to do your inside pass, you have to, if this is your alignment edge on this side of the workstation, to cut the matching piece, you have to get that out. You can't cut it like this. You have to actually flip it 180 degrees around. The nice thing though is you can do these cuts just with your straight bit. So again, I think eventually Shaper is going to come out with instructions on that. They just released a video in, I want to say July, walking through how to do it with what's currently available. You would need Fusion 360. They built a nice little piece of software with Fusion 360 to make dovetails of about any size, as long as you can get the corresponding bit to fit onto the shank of the Shaper origin, then you can cut them. But that's a lot to go into without having access to a computer to show you Fusion 360 and how to actually set that up. But I will pass this around if people want to see the dovetails.
I have a question,
Yeah, please.
and pardon my ignorance, but I guess I've lost the connect here. You did a 0-0 thing, which you took a bit against an x-axis, then you did it on the y-axis to determine your 0-0 point.
Yep.
Then what's the purpose of these domino things then?
Okay, so
What does that do for you?
alright, the dominoes are what triangulates the position of the bit. So if you can see what it's looking at right here, that little white dot is where the bit's at on this side of the workstation. It knows that position because I've scanned in the images of the dominoes, and it's able to tell that each one of these is a set length and width. And with that information, it's able to triangulate the exact position of this bit because it knows from the field of view of the camera to the center of that router collet what that precise point is.
Okay.
Yep.
So when you're putting them stickers on, you can slap them on wherever? Just-
Yeah. You can, as long as they're flat, that's the most important thing. I tend to put them on pretty heavily because I don't like it to lose its position. But long story short, it needs at least 2 strips and 3 different dominoes to position itself. If you just had 1 strip of tape, it wouldn't be able to tell what the depth is between, let's say, this point and that point. But if you've got 2 lines, it knows what that distance is.
Calculate the rest.
Yeah, and then it can calculate the rest off of there. So as long as you're not removing tape as you cut through a project, you're doing okay. I know someone, he's renting some space from my boss currently, and he's building a catamaran style boat, and he's been cutting bulkheads. He has to cut close to 300 different sheets of plywood into a variety of pieces ranging from about 4 by 4 inches, up to about 4 foot by 4 foot. So he's been using the Shaper origin to cut those bulkheads to the precise size that he needs to fit into the bulkheads of his catamaran style boat. Doing the file conversion has been the most tedious part for him, but as he claims, he's saving so much time not having to sand down the edges where he used to be cutting those out with a jigsaw by using this, that it's entirely worth it to him. And I'm just excited to see that boat when it's ready to go out on the water. Yeah.
I have another stupid question.
No problem. There's no stupid questions.
You're the one moving this,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't move itself any.
It can move itself within a 1/2 inch diameter. That little white circle there.
So what keeps you from I would be shaking and making enough, trying to keep a straight line to cut those. What keeps you from going overcutting?
From overcutting?
Yeah,
Well,
cut into your pins. What keeps you from doing that? I mean, does it?
can I volunteer you for trying it?
Oh, Whenever you go outside that half inch, you said it retracts itself.
Yep, exactly. So I just real quick created a couple lines. You can see it all joins together. When I am actually cutting this, it knows to keep that little white dot on the center of that line. So as long, like I can move this back and forth. If I were doing this in a piece of wood, it would certainly be going outside the line because it can't adjust as quickly as I can wiggle it. But if you can hold it steady enough to just move smoothly and keep that little dot in between those four little crosshairs, you're gonna get a smooth quality of cut every time, probably within a couple hundredths of an inch. It really does a lot of the work for alignment for you.
What you can't see, that I can see, is the router is moving independent of the thing that he's holding.
It had that anti-drift software in it. So
I
it'll
see.
stay on that
I
path.
see, I assumed the router was fixed.
Oh, no, yeah, the router itself moves on the XY within that half-inch diameter circle.
Okay, that explains.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
What you should
Yeah.
do is, when you have time, just play with it. They get the feel of it.
Yeah.
Is that like when you're driving the car and you get too close to the edge and go?
Yeah, the rumble strip kind of thing. That's a good way to think about it. I can't think of a perfect analogy for it, but it's more like having the what do they call it in bowling, the rails, the bumpers in bowling, where if you bounce the bowling, I've only seen kids do this, but if you can bounce the bowling ball out of your lane onto another, you've made a mistake. But as long as you can keep it within those two rails, it's gonna be fine. Yeah. I'll try and show it from this side if people can see a little bit better. All I'm doing is moving the base, but the center of that bit is keeping its point over the line. Yeah. Bob, would you like to talk about?
Yeah, I've had the shape of work since December, and I play a lot with the box joints. And what I like about it is, you tell it how wide the wood is, how deep you want to go, how thick it is, and you tell the number of pins you want on it, so you have a lot of versatility with it. And these are some of the things I made, but this is a ring box I made for my wife, and it was very simple to do. If it fits on that workstation, you can cut the pins fairly easy. You just got to take your time. But I'll pass that around. I think that has 5 pins on it in total, and then I made a guy this gift. He celebrated 60 years wedding anniversary, and again, you just set it up, your A side and your B side in the workstation, and you just take your time, you cut the pins, and here I have, 7 pins on it, so you just go nice and slow with it. It does almost all the work for you. I don't know. Please be careful with that, though.
Who hasn't seen this yet?
No, in fact, the fit is so tight, there's no sanding, no need to use a chisel on it at all. And usually when you put it together, it's square, because it's been cut so perfectly with that.
Thank you. So did you get the workstation, Bob, or did you make your own?
I got the workstation.
Okay.
And I'm glad I did, because it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah.
And the key thing is, when you put the wood in that workstation, get it as tight as you can, because if it's not tight, it's gonna drift on you. And then you're gonna have mistakes made.
Yeah, any movement when you're cutting, it's not going to know that the wood moved, and it's just going to keep cutting where it thinks you should.
Those are Brussels hinges.
What?
Brussels hinges. Brussels.
The question is, where did you get them?
I ordered them from Brussels.
Spell it.
BRUSSO.
Did you cut the mortises for the hinges with the shaper as well?
No, I did not. I did it with a small router, but actually, you can actually cut the mortises with the shaper by knowing the dimensions of the hinges and the depth with the shaper. And it would be, you probably have to chisel out a little bit of one corner with it, but they're fairly easy to work with.
Does this thing go through a lot of router bits?
Because with only just having a 1/4 inch shaft on it, it seems like you have a lot of heat.
Yeah, so I was even doing 1/2 inch depth passes on that. Osage is pretty soft, so it's a little more forgiving than harder woods, but you're going to use up router bits just like you will in any other router. So I tend to go through, if I'm doing a really big project like cutting out the workstation, I probably use like 1.5 bits. Yeah.
Okay, well, I use are 1/2 inch router bits as it is.
Yeah.
1/2 inch shafts, I still go through those because I use a lot of oak.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and oak especially is going to burn them up even quicker. You can see, and this one has got some noticeable charring on the end that you can probably see in the back. Especially if you're doing a lot of plunge cuts, it does tend to burn these up pretty quickly. But that's going to happen with just about any router that you're using. Engraving bits do last quite a bit longer. I think it's a little bit easier on them because you can control the depth of cut. So you know that you're basically only using the very tip of this thing, and these are actually pretty easy to sharpen if you've just got a flat stone.
So your engraver bit, it's not a V bit?
Yeah, engraving bit, it is a V-style bit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It looked like it here.
Yeah, I want to say that one's about a 30 degree. So anything on the 1/4 inch shank you can put on here. The finest bit I use is that like 3/64 inch point. So I tended to do a couple of passes before I even put that bit on the machine because I want to make sure that it's not doing the work removing material, it's just cutting my final depth of cut. So I'll usually pocket things out with a 1/4 inch bit and then go in for the final pass with something finer.
Can you buy parts and pieces, so like if that router portion dies out of warranty, can you order just that?
Just the router motor itself, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. They have a the general warranty is, I believe, 3 years, and it will replace anything on it. They do have a professional one, if anybody's using this as a tool for their job, where no questions asked, they will send you a new replacement one in a box that you can use to send your damaged one back if there's something that needs to be worked on it. I only know a couple contractors that are using it like that professionally. One of the crazier ones, he's actually been doing a lot of custom inlay on people's ceilings with this. So the hardest part of that is actually holding this thing above your head for a while and not dropping it on yourself. Because, yeah, this thing is pretty heavy, especially if you're trying to hold it above your head for any length of time. But it can be done. If it's a flat surface, you can cut on it.
Is it made in USA?
No. So the company is headquartered in California, but the motor itself is actually made by Tool Technik, which is Festool's parent company over in Germany. Yeah, so it's made over there. This is actually the same motor that they use on the 1400 router. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I believe the electronics are made in Taiwan, as most things are these days. Yeah.
Good job.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Bob for setting this up. He was the one that invited me over to do it. And thank you again, Dustin, for hosting, and your lovely family. I didn't catch your name, but thank you.